Gateway International Airport falls into stunned silence as federal aviation authorities display FAA credentials while Director Angela Brooks personally revokes the airport's operating certificate in front of shocked passengers and airline executives. Manager Steve Morrison's confident authority crumbles as he recognizes the woman whose family he'd subjected to systematic racial profiling just 4 hours earlier. The same woman he'd dismissed as another complainant, making false accusations about professional security procedures. "Good afternoon, Mr. Morrison," Director Brooks announces, her voice carrying unmistakable federal aviation authority throughout the packed terminal. "I am Director Angela Brooks, Federal Aviation Administration. Some of you may not recognize me from this morning's incident where my family was subjected to discriminatory treatment while I was traveling to address aviation safety concerns." Her eyes lock onto Morrison, who has gone pale. "Manager Morrison, I believe we need to discuss why you systematically profile minority travelers, direct staff to conduct illegal searches based on racial characteristics, and told federal investigators that certain passenger demographics require enhanced scrutiny for legitimate security reasons." The gathered crowd freezes in recognition. The airport manager, who 4 hours ago had wielded absolute operational authority, now faces the FAA director, whose federal oversight will shut down his entire facility, and the airport's operating license has just been permanently suspended. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 84 hours earlier, FAA Director Angela Brooks had been reviewing aviation safety compliance reports at Department of Transportation headquarters when she received concerning intelligence about systematic civil rights violations at major airports that would require the most sensitive federal investigation of her 18-year aviation career. At 44, Brooks had built her reputation on comprehensive aviation safety oversight and institutional accountability that ensured airports operated according to federal regulations while protecting passenger rights and constitutional protections during travel procedures. Her appointment as FAA director had been recognition of her exceptional ability to balance aviation safety requirements with civil rights compliance, implementing regulatory frameworks that enhanced both security effectiveness and constitutional protection for all travelers. The Gateway International Airport investigation had emerged from federal monitoring of passenger complaint patterns, revealing systematic discrimination that violated both aviation regulations and federal civil rights protections designed to ensure equal treatment during air travel. Statistical analysis indicated that minority passengers at Gateway experienced 89% longer security processing times, 67% higher rates of additional screening procedures, and 234% more frequent random searches compared to white travelers with identical tickets and documentation. What made the investigation particularly complex was evidence suggesting coordination between airport management and certain federal security agencies that had created systematic profiling operations disguised as enhanced security measures protecting aviation safety. Manager Steve Morrison had been directing Gateway operations for 8 years, using his position to implement discriminatory policies that targeted minority travelers through systematic profiling disguised as legitimate security procedures and aviation safety protocols. Morrison's approach to airport management reflected personal racial bias rather than evidence-based security assessment. His operational decisions designed to intimidate and discourage minority travel while maintaining plausible deniability about intentional discrimination. His discriminatory practices had been enabled by institutional tolerance from federal oversight agencies who prioritized appearance of enhanced security over constitutional compliance and equal treatment requirements that democratic institutions demanded. Security Chief Eddie Walsh had been implementing Morrison's discriminatory directives through systematic profiling that violated both federal aviation regulations and constitutional protections, creating hostile environment for minority travelers seeking equal access to air transportation. Morrison's security protocols require enhanced screening procedures for passengers who fit certain demographic profiles. Walsh had documented in operational reports that revealed systematic bias disguised as professional security assessment. The institutional protection for discriminatory practices had enabled Morrison's bias to flourish while creating legal liability for federal agencies and airport authorities who were required to ensure constitutional compliance rather than systematic civil rights violations. Federal coordination had been complicated by jurisdictional overlaps between FAA aviation regulation, TSA security oversight, and Department of Justice civil rights enforcement that required careful coordination to address systematic discrimination without compromising legitimate security operations. Dr. Marcus Johnson, a prominent cardiologist, had been planning family travel to attend medical conferences while providing educational opportunities for his children Tyler and Zara, with his wife Dr. Vanessa Johnson and mother Grandma Pearl Johnson. The Johnson family represented successful professional achievement and community leadership, their travel experiences typically characterized by respectful treatment and professional courtesy that reflected their social status and economic stability. What the family hadn't anticipated was that their race would trigger systematic discrimination at Gateway International Airport, where Morrison's profiling operations targeted successful minority families as particular threats requiring enhanced scrutiny and intimidation. Brooks's personal connection to the Johnson family was through her sister Dr. Vanessa Johnson, whose marriage to Dr. Marcus Johnson had created family relationships that would transform routine discrimination into federal investigation requiring comprehensive accountability. The family's travel plans included connecting flights through Gateway International Airport, where Morrison's discriminatory operations would subject them to systematic profiling and constitutional violations that federal oversight was designed to prevent. Brooks had been unaware of her family's specific travel arrangements due to operational security requirements that prevented personal coordination during federal travel, but their experience would trigger the kind of federal response that civil rights violations demanded. Assistant Director Thomas Reed had been coordinating federal aviation oversight while monitoring compliance patterns that revealed concerning trends in passenger treatment and constitutional violations at major airports requiring federal intervention. Gateway Airport shows systematic patterns of discriminatory treatment that violate both aviation regulations and civil rights protections. Reed had briefed Brooks during routine oversight coordination. Federal investigation may be necessary to address institutional rather than individual compliance problems. The federal monitoring had been tracking exactly the discrimination patterns that the Johnson family would experience, while ensuring that systematic violations would face comprehensive federal accountability rather than administrative correction. Aviation Inspector Jennifer Cole had been conducting compliance reviews at major airports, while documenting constitutional violations and gathering evidence that would support federal prosecution under civil rights statutes designed to address government discrimination. Airport security operations show systematic bias patterns that violate federal civil rights protections and aviation regulatory requirements, Cole had reported to Federal Investigation Coordination meetings. Federal Prosecutor Patricia Williams had been reviewing aviation discrimination cases while preparing comprehensive prosecution frameworks that would address both individual misconduct and institutional patterns enabling systematic civil rights violations. As Brooks had been finalizing her travel arrangements for aviation safety conferences, she was unaware that her family's experience at Gateway International Airport would transform routine federal oversight into personal involvement requiring immediate federal intervention and comprehensive accountability for systematic discrimination. The federal investigation was designed to address aviation industry discrimination while protecting passenger rights, but Morrison's targeting of Brooks's family would escalate routine compliance review into federal crisis, requiring immediate aviation authority intervention. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Johnson family arrived at Gateway International Airport at 7:30 a.m. for their 10:15 a.m. departure. Dr. Marcus Johnson's 17 years of frequent business travel having established confidence in routine airport procedures and professional treatment during security screening and boarding processes. The family's appearance projected success and respectability. Professional attire, quality luggage, and organized travel documentation that should have prompted courteous service and efficient processing through standard airport procedures. Tyler Johnson, 16, and Zara Johnson, 14, demonstrated the composure and respect that their parents had taught them for travel situations, while Grandma Pearl Johnson carried herself with dignity that reflected decades of community leadership and family guidance. Manager Morrison observed the family's approach with immediate hostility that exceeded routine security assessment, his expression revealing racial bias rather than professional evaluation of passenger documentation or behavior patterns. Security. We have a family that requires enhanced screening procedures, Morrison announced loudly enough for surrounding passengers to hear, his public designation creating immediate attention and stigmatization that violated privacy rights and professional courtesy. Dr. Marcus Johnson approached the situation with professional courtesy. Good morning. We're the Johnson family traveling to Atlanta for medical conferences. Our documentation is complete and we're allowing extra time for any necessary procedures. His respectful cooperation should have prompted standard processing, but Morrison's response revealed predetermined conclusions based on racial characteristics rather than passenger behavior or documentation quality. Sir, enhanced security procedures require additional verification and screening that may involve extended processing time, Morrison stated with authority, designed to intimidate rather than inform. Certain passenger profiles warrant additional attention for aviation safety purposes. The reference to passenger profiles, while suggesting aviation safety concerns, demonstrated exactly the discriminatory profiling that federal aviation regulations were designed to prevent and prosecute. Dr. Vanessa Johnson, whose professional travel experience included international medical conferences, recognized inappropriate treatment. Manager Morrison, could you explain what specific security concerns require enhanced procedures for our family? Her reasonable question about screening rationale was legally appropriate and procedurally standard. But Morrison's reaction revealed defensive hostility about accountability rather than transparent cooperation with legitimate passenger inquiries. Ma'am, security procedures are determined by trained professionals based on multiple factors that passengers don't need to understand, Morrison replied dismissively. Your cooperation is required, not explanations about legitimate airport operations. The refusal to provide basic information about screening procedures violated passenger rights while demonstrating discriminatory treatment that federal oversight was designed to identify and address. Security Chief Walsh implemented Morrison's directives by separating family members for individual questioning that created trauma and violated family unity rights. We need to interview each family member separately to ensure consistent information and identify any security concerns. The family separation tactics exceeded security requirements while creating psychological pressure designed to intimidate rather than ensure aviation safety through legitimate screening procedures. Grandma Pearl Johnson, whose decades of civil rights experience had taught her to recognize institutional discrimination, attempted family advocacy. Officer Walsh, our family is traveling together with proper documentation. Why are we being separated when other families proceed together? Her question revealed community wisdom about civil rights protection while highlighting disparate treatment that violated equal protection requirements and professional airport standards. Tyler Johnson, despite his youth, recognized unfair treatment. Dad, why are they treating us differently than the white families who went through security without any extra procedures? His observation of disparate treatment provided witness testimony about systematic discrimination, while demonstrating family awareness of constitutional violations and civil rights abuse. Captain Lisa Martinez, an airline pilot observing the screening area, recognized obvious profiling. This family is being subjected to discriminatory treatment based on racial characteristics rather than security indicators. This violates federal aviation regulations and civil rights protections. Her professional aviation perspective provided expert testimony about regulatory violations, while confirming that Morrison's procedures exceeded legitimate security requirements. Business traveler David Chen, who frequently used Gateway Airport, documented the discriminatory treatment. I've never seen white families subjected to this level of screening and family separation. This appears to be systematic racial profiling rather than security procedures. His witness testimony provided additional evidence of disparate treatment while demonstrating community recognition of civil rights violations and institutional discrimination. Morrison escalated discriminatory procedures by ordering invasive searches. This family requires complete baggage search, personal screening, and documentation verification. Enhanced procedures are necessary for passengers who fit certain risk profiles. The risk profiles, based on racial characteristics while ignoring legitimate documentation and cooperative behavior, demonstrated exactly the systematic bias that federal civil rights enforcement was designed to prosecute. Flight attendant Nicole Brown attempted passenger advocacy. Manager Morrison, this family has proper documentation and is cooperating fully. The enhanced procedures appear excessive for routine security screening. Her professional aviation perspective confirmed that Morrison's treatment exceeded standard procedures while violating both regulatory requirements and constitutional protections. As Morrison continued systematic discrimination while multiple witnesses documented obvious civil rights violations, the Johnson family experienced exactly the institutional racism that federal oversight was designed to prevent through aviation regulation and constitutional enforcement. The family's travel experience was transforming from routine airport processing to systematic civil rights violations that would trigger federal investigation and comprehensive accountability for institutional discrimination in aviation operations. Morrison's discriminatory treatment was occurring under federal aviation authority, while violating both regulatory compliance and constitutional protections that democratic institutions required for equal treatment and passenger rights. The discrimination against the Johnson family intensified as Manager Morrison escalated systematic profiling procedures, while airport witnesses recognized obvious civil rights violations that exceeded any legitimate security requirements or aviation safety protocols. Dr. Johnson, your family's travel patterns and documentation require additional verification that may involve extended screening procedures, Morrison announced, with increasing authority, designed to justify discriminatory treatment through fabricated security concerns. Dr. Marcus Johnson maintained professional composure while documenting constitutional violations. Manager Morrison, our family has proper documentation, confirmed reservations, and no security history. Could you specify what verification requirements necessitate different treatment than other passengers receive? His reasonable request for procedural explanation was legally appropriate and should have prompted transparent information about screening rationale, but Morrison's response revealed defensive hostility about accountability rather than professional cooperation. Dr. Johnson, security procedures are determined by trained airport personnel based on factors that passengers aren't qualified to evaluate or question. Morrison replied with dismissive authority. Your compliance is required, not explanations about legitimate operational decisions. The refusal to provide basic procedural information while demanding compliance without justification violated passenger rights and demonstrated exactly the arbitrary authority that federal oversight was designed to prevent. Dr. Vanessa Johnson escalated family advocacy despite recognition that challenging authority might worsen their treatment. Manager Morrison, our children are becoming distressed by this treatment. As medical professionals, we understand security requirements, but this appears to exceed standard procedures. Her professional credentials and reasonable concern for family welfare should have prompted consideration for appropriate treatment. But Morrison's reaction revealed systematic bias rather than responsive customer service. Dr. Johnson, passenger. Stress doesn't override security requirements, Morrison stated, with calculated indifference. Families who cooperate with enhanced procedures will experience smoother processing than those who create complications through unnecessary challenges. The implied threat of worsened treatment for questioning procedures demonstrated abuse of authority designed to prevent accountability rather than ensure security compliance. Security Chief Walsh implemented increasingly invasive procedures that violated privacy rights. We need to conduct individual physical searches and complete baggage examination for each family member. Enhanced security requires thorough verification that standard procedures might not provide. The escalation to physical searches without security justification violated constitutional protections while creating trauma designed to discourage future travel rather than ensure aviation safety. Tyler Johnson, despite his parents' instructions to remain calm, challenged obvious discrimination. Why are you searching our family when you didn't search any white families? This is racial profiling, and it's illegal. His direct accusation of discrimination, while accurate, prompted Morrison's defensive anger. Young man, security decisions are made by professionals based on legitimate factors. Accusations of bias demonstrate exactly the kind of attitude that requires additional attention. The characterization of civil rights awareness as problematic attitude, while escalating punishment for recognizing discrimination, confirmed systematic constitutional violations and institutional racism. Grandma Pearl Johnson provided community wisdom about civil rights protection. Manager Morrison, I've lived through systematic discrimination, and I recognize it when I see it. This treatment violates our constitutional rights and federal protections. Her historical perspective and moral authority should have prompted reflection about discriminatory treatment, but Morrison's response revealed institutional arrogance. Ma'am, this is post-9/11 aviation security, not civil rights activism. Modern security requirements override historical complaints about appropriate procedures. The dismissal of constitutional protections as historical complaints, while claiming security authority to violate civil rights, demonstrated exactly the institutional bias that federal oversight was designed to address. Pilot Martinez documented Morrison's systematic violations while coordinating with airline management. This discriminatory treatment violates federal aviation regulations and creates legal liability for the airport. I'm documenting everything for federal authorities. Her professional aviation expertise and federal reporting obligations provided crucial witness testimony while triggering institutional accountability that Morrison couldn't prevent through local authority. Airport CEO Kim notified about passenger complaints and potential federal violations, approached the situation with obvious concern about legal liability. Manager Morrison, what security factors justify enhanced procedures for this family? Morrison's response to executive oversight revealed defensive justification. CEO Kim, security protocols require enhanced screening for passengers who fit certain risk profiles. Professional security assessment indicates additional verification requirements. The continued reference to risk profiles based on racial characteristics while claiming professional assessment that obviously violated constitutional protections confirmed systematic discrimination requiring federal intervention. Frequent flyer Dorothy Hayes, who had observed Morrison's treatment of multiple minority families, provided pattern evidence. Manager Morrison has been systematically targeting black families for enhanced screening while allowing white passengers to proceed without additional procedures. This is obvious discrimination. Her documentation of systematic patterns rather than isolated incidents provided evidence of institutional bias requiring comprehensive federal accountability rather than individual case resolution. Travel agent Sarah Mitchell attempted professional intervention. Manager Morrison, as a travel industry professional, I can confirm this family has legitimate documentation and reservations. The enhanced procedures appear excessive and potentially discriminatory. Her industry expertise should have provided authoritative validation of passenger legitimacy, but Morrison's dismissal revealed systematic bias. Travel agents don't determine airport security requirements. Professional security assessment supersedes industry opinions about passenger processing. As Morrison continued escalating discriminatory treatment while multiple witnesses documented systematic civil rights violations, the situation had evolved beyond routine security screening to institutional racism, requiring immediate federal intervention. The Johnson family's experience was providing exactly the documented evidence that federal civil rights enforcement required for comprehensive prosecution of systematic discrimination in aviation operations. Morrison's continued constitutional violations, despite witness testimony and professional challenge, demonstrated institutional confidence that discrimination would be protected rather than prosecuted through federal accountability. While Manager Morrison escalated his discriminatory treatment of the Johnson family at Gateway International Airport, comprehensive federal aviation oversight systems were rapidly detecting civil rights violations that would trigger the largest FAA investigation into systematic airport discrimination in agency history. FAA headquarters was monitoring real-time passenger complaint data and security processing metrics that showed unprecedented patterns at Gateway, requiring immediate federal attention and potential civil rights prosecution coordination with Department of Justice. Assistant Director Reed received automated alerts about extended screening times and discrimination complaints that exceeded normal operational parameters. Gateway Airport is showing systematic patterns of discriminatory treatment requiring immediate federal investigation and management accountability. The federal monitoring systems had been designed to identify exactly the kind of systematic bias that the Johnson family was experiencing, while ensuring that civil rights violations triggered immediate accountability rather than administrative delays. Aviation Inspector Cole was analyzing passenger processing data that confirmed systematic patterns of discriminatory treatment affecting minority travelers. Gateway's operational metrics show demographic disparities that violate both aviation regulations and federal civil rights protections requiring immediate intervention. Federal coordination protocols had been established through Department of Transportation and Department of Justice that tracked aviation discrimination while ensuring systematic violations faced appropriate legal accountability. Department of Transportation oversight agencies were reviewing Morrison's operational decisions and security procedures that revealed concerning patterns of constitutional violations requiring federal civil rights enforcement and potential criminal prosecution. Morrison's airport management shows systematic discrimination that violates federal aviation regulations and constitutional protections. Oversight coordinator reported to federal investigation teams. The federal documentation was accumulating evidence of institutional bias that exceeded individual misconduct to demonstrate systematic civil rights violations requiring comprehensive federal response. Meanwhile, investigative reporter James Parker had been researching aviation industry discrimination patterns as part of comprehensive journalism examining civil rights compliance in transportation sectors and institutional accountability for systematic bias. Gateway Airport appears in multiple databases for discriminatory treatment and civil rights violations affecting minority passengers, Parker reported to his news organization. His journalism was documenting industry-wide problems that would complement federal civil rights enforcement while ensuring public accountability for systematic discrimination in aviation operations. Civil rights attorney Angela Davis was representing multiple clients affected by aviation discrimination while building federal civil rights cases that would address systematic industry problems rather than individual incidents. Gateway Airport. Discrimination affects dozens of families while representing systematic civil rights violations requiring federal prosecution, Davis told civil rights coordination meetings. The legal framework was elevating individual cases to systematic institutional analysis that examined structural racism and federal accountability requirements for constitutional compliance. Congressional Representative Thompson, who served on House Transportation Committee, had been reviewing federal oversight of aviation civil rights compliance and institutional accountability requirements for government contractors. Aviation discrimination represents systematic threat to equal access when airports violate rather than protect constitutional rights, Thompson stated during congressional briefing about transportation civil rights enforcement. Congressional oversight was preparing legislative accountability that would complement federal prosecution while ensuring systematic aviation reform rather than individual punishment. Community advocacy organizations were coordinating legal assistance while documenting systematic aviation discrimination affecting multiple families and communities throughout the region. Morrison's discrimination represents systematic aviation bias that terrorizes minority travelers while violating constitutional protections, community advocate reported. Community documentation was providing additional evidence of systematic patterns while ensuring that federal prosecution addressed broader constitutional compliance rather than individual criminal behavior. Federal Emergency Management Coordination was monitoring transportation system civil rights compliance while documenting constitutional violations that compromised emergency response and community safety. Aviation discrimination undermines emergency transportation and community safety when airports violate constitutional protections, FEMA coordination reported. Federal intelligence agencies were analyzing institutional racism patterns while coordinating with civil rights prosecutors about systematic constitutional violations that threatened democratic institution integrity. Systematic aviation discrimination represents institutional threat to constitutional transportation and democratic access, Federal Intelligence Analysis reported. Transportation industry oversight agencies were monitoring competitive impacts, while recognizing that systematic discrimination damaged entire aviation industry reputation and required comprehensive reform. Aviation discrimination threatens industry reputation and passenger confidence when airports violate civil rights protections, Industry Oversight Coordinator reported. Federal Aviation Administration was conducting systematic review of airport civil rights compliance while coordinating with Department of Justice about potential criminal prosecution for institutional constitutional violations. Gateway Airport's discriminatory patterns violate federal aviation regulations and constitutional protections, requiring immediate federal intervention, FAA oversight reported. As multiple federal oversight systems detected Morrison's discrimination, while the Johnson family continued experiencing systematic bias, comprehensive federal accountability was developing that would address both individual misconduct and institutional problems. The convergence of aviation regulation, civil rights enforcement, and community advocacy was creating comprehensive response that would expose systematic discrimination while ensuring federal prosecution and industry reform. Director Brooks's family was experiencing discrimination within complex federal systems designed to protect both aviation safety and civil rights compliance. But Morrison's systematic bias had triggered exactly the kind of federal intervention that regulatory oversight was designed to provide. The federal monitoring systems were documenting not only individual discrimination against the Johnson family, but systematic institutional patterns that threatened both aviation regulation compliance and constitutional protections for all passengers. Morrison's continued civil rights violations were occurring under Federal Aviation Authority, while multiple oversight agencies prepared comprehensive response that would ensure both individual accountability and systematic industry reform, addressing institutional racism in transportation operations. Director Angela Brooks was completing aviation safety briefings at Department of Transportation headquarters when she received emergency notification about systematic civil rights violations affecting her family at Gateway International Airport, triggering immediate federal response protocols that would transform routine oversight into comprehensive institutional accountability. The emergency alert system indicated that the Johnson family was experiencing systematic discrimination that exceeded routine passenger complaints while requiring immediate federal intervention to protect both family welfare and institutional civil rights compliance. Director Brooks, your family is experiencing systematic discriminatory treatment at Gateway Airport that violates federal aviation regulations and constitutional protections, Assistant Director Reed reported via secure communication. Manager, Morrison is implementing systematic profiling that requires immediate federal response. The federal alert confirmed that Morrison's discrimination had triggered comprehensive oversight mechanisms while requiring Director Brooks to balance personal family protection with professional federal authority and institutional accountability requirements. Brooks activated immediate federal intervention protocols while coordinating comprehensive response that would address both family protection and systematic civil rights violations. Initiate immediate federal aviation oversight at Gateway Airport. Full federal authority for civil rights enforcement and operational accountability. Federal coordination teams positioned throughout the region received authorization for intervention designed to protect civil rights compliance while ensuring systematic discrimination faced comprehensive federal prosecution rather than administrative correction. Assistant Director Reed coordinated comprehensive federal response involving aviation regulation, civil rights enforcement, and institutional accountability. Gateway Airport requires immediate federal oversight for systematic discrimination. Full federal authority for operational suspension and management accountability. The Federal Intervention Authority provided comprehensive tools for addressing both individual discrimination and institutional bias, requiring systematic federal prosecution rather than local administrative resolution. Aviation Inspector Cole arrived at Gateway Airport with federal oversight authority and comprehensive evidence of systematic civil rights violations. Manager Morrison, Federal Aviation Oversight, is documenting systematic discrimination that violates both regulatory compliance and constitutional protections. The federal presence with oversight authority demonstrated that Morrison's bias had triggered comprehensive federal response that local operational control couldn't prevent through administrative procedures or jurisdictional claims. Morrison attempted to minimize federal oversight. Inspector Cole, airport security procedures are implemented according to federal guidelines and professional security assessment. Local operational decisions don't require federal micromanagement or civil rights investigation. Cole's response revealed the scope of federal evidence. Manager Morrison, systematic racial profiling violates federal aviation regulations and constitutional protections. Your discriminatory treatment affects not only individual passengers, but federal regulatory compliance and civil rights enforcement. The Federal Aviation Authority made clear that civil rights violations exceeded local operational authority, while triggering mandatory federal accountability regardless of security justification or administrative convenience. Federal Prosecutor Williams arrived with comprehensive legal authority for civil rights prosecution. Manager Morrison, systematic discrimination against minority passengers constitutes federal crimes under multiple civil rights statutes. Federal prosecution authority supersedes local operational discretion. The federal prosecution framework eliminated Morrison's ability to characterize discrimination as security procedures while establishing criminal accountability for systematic constitutional violations. At 11:47 a.m., Director Brooks arrived at Gateway Airport with full federal aviation authority, while family protection remained paramount concern, requiring immediate accountability for systematic discrimination and institutional bias. Manager Morrison, Brooks announced with complete federal authority. This is Director Angela Brooks, Federal Aviation Administration. I am here to address systematic civil rights violations affecting passengers, including my own family members, while conducting comprehensive aviation regulatory enforcement. The revelation of Director Brooks's Federal Aviation Authority eliminated any possibility of continued discrimination while demonstrating that civil rights violations had attracted the highest levels of federal attention and accountability. Morrison's shock at Federal Aviation Authority was evident as he recognized that his discrimination had been directed against family members of FAA director whose institutional authority would ensure comprehensive prosecution rather than administrative protection. Director Brooks, I had no knowledge of your family relationship, Morrison stammered while attempting to minimize discriminatory treatment. Security procedures are implemented according to federal guidelines rather than passenger identification or family connections. Brooks's response was definitive. Manager Morrison, systematic racial profiling violates federal aviation regulations and constitutional protections regardless of passenger identity or family relationships. Your discriminatory treatment affects all passengers and threatens aviation industry compliance with civil rights requirements. Airport CEO Kim provided institutional damage control. Director Brooks, if airport security procedures appear discriminatory, that reflects training deficiencies rather than intentional bias. Federal oversight can address systematic concerns through appropriate administrative coordination. Federal legal authority eliminated institutional deflection. CEO Kim, systematic discrimination requires immediate federal intervention rather than administrative training. Civil rights violations constitute federal crimes that exceed training adequacy or institutional coordination. As Federal Aviation Authority secured evidence of systematic discrimination while protecting the Johnson family from continued constitutional violations, comprehensive federal accountability was ensuring both individual protection and institutional reform. Federal oversight had demonstrated that civil rights violations in aviation operations triggered immediate federal response when systematic bias threatened both individual constitutional rights and broader regulatory compliance. The FAA director, whose family had experienced systematic discrimination, now possessed both personal motivation and institutional authority to ensure comprehensive federal accountability for aviation industry civil rights violations and constitutional compliance. Morrison's airport operations faced immediate federal suspension, while systematic discrimination would be prosecuted under federal authority that exceeded local operational protection and administrative convenience through comprehensive civil rights enforcement. Gateway International Airport became the epicenter of Federal Aviation Authority revelation that would expose systematic discrimination while demonstrating how quickly operational control could collapse when civil rights violations affected the family of the federal official responsible for aviation oversight. Manager Steve Morrison, Director Brooks announced, her voice carrying unmistakable Federal Aviation Authority throughout the crowded terminal. I am Director Angela Brooks, Federal Aviation Administration. For the past 4 hours, you have subjected my family to systematic racial profiling and civil rights violations while operating under Federal Aviation Authority that I directly oversee. Morrison stood paralyzed as the full implications of his actions became clear. The family he had systematically discriminated against was connected to the FAA director whose federal authority controlled his airport's operational certification and whose jurisdiction could immediately suspend all aviation operations. Director Brooks, I had no way of knowing your family connection, Morrison stammered, his operational confidence dissolving as he recognized that his discrimination had targeted the family of someone whose authority far exceeded local airport management. Security procedures are implemented according to federal guidelines rather than passenger identification or relationships. Brooks's response eliminated any possibility of hiding behind procedural justification. Manager Morrison, my family relationship is irrelevant to the fact that you systematically violate federal aviation regulations and constitutional protections affecting minority passengers. Your discriminatory treatment would have been equally illegal, regardless of passenger identity. The distinction between failing to recognize federal family connections and systematically violating civil rights made Morrison's actions indefensible under any regulatory or constitutional standard. Assistant Director Reed stepped forward with immediate federal accountability. Steve Morrison, your airport operations are suspended immediately for systematic civil rights violations, discriminatory passenger treatment, and violation of federal aviation regulations under Director Brooks's direct oversight. Airport CEO Kim, realizing that federal intervention had documented institutional discrimination, attempted to distance airport authority from Morrison's systematic bias. Director Brooks, Gateway Airport policy prohibits discriminatory treatment and requires constitutional compliance. Manager Morrison's behavior does not represent institutional standards or federal regulatory training. Aviation, Inspector Cole's response revealed the scope of federal evidence. CEO Kim, systematic monitoring shows institutional patterns of Discriminatory enablement through administrative tolerance. Airport management enabled rather than prevented civil rights violations, requiring comprehensive federal accountability. The systematic discrimination charges made clear that Morrison's individual bias had been supported by institutional tolerance, requiring comprehensive operational restructuring rather than individual personnel discipline. Captain Martinez, who had documented Morrison's discriminatory treatment, provided additional evidence to federal investigators. Director Brooks, I recorded Manager Morrison's systematic racial profiling affecting multiple minority families over 6 months while reporting concerns that were ignored by airport management. Her professional aviation testimony provided crucial insider evidence of systematic institutional bias, while demonstrating pilot integrity that federal accountability should protect and encourage. Dr. Marcus Johnson, whose family had experienced systematic discrimination, addressed federal authorities about broader accountability. Director Brooks, Manager Morrison's bias represents systematic civil rights violations affecting dozens of passengers over multiple years. Federal prosecution should address institutional patterns rather than individual misconduct. Family perspective provided crucial context about systematic institutional damage that affected not only individual travelers, but broader civil rights compliance and aviation industry reputation. Grandma Pearl Johnson provided community wisdom about systematic institutional change. Director Brooks, Morrison's discrimination represents years of institutional bias that terrorized minority travelers while violating constitutional protections. Federal accountability must address systematic rather than individual civil rights violations. Community perspective demonstrated understanding that individual discrimination reflected broader institutional problems requiring comprehensive federal intervention rather than selective administrative correction. Security Chief Walsh, who had implemented Morrison's discriminatory directives, attempted to minimize institutional culpability. Director Brooks, if security procedures appear discriminatory, that reflects federal training emphasis rather than intentional bias. Airport security personnel implement guidelines that federal oversight might interpret differently. Federal Prosecutor Williams eliminated his deflection with criminal authority. Chief Walsh, systematic racial profiling constitutes federal crimes, regardless of training, justification, or procedural interpretation. Constitutional violations require criminal prosecution rather than administrative correction. The Federal Prosecution Authority made clear that systematic discrimination exceeded administrative concerns while triggering mandatory criminal accountability for civil rights violations. Business traveler Chen provided witness testimony confirming systematic bias. Director Brooks, Morrison consistently subjected minority passengers to discriminatory treatment while allowing white travelers standard processing. This represents institutional pattern affecting multiple families. His documentation validated federal evidence while demonstrating community recognition of systematic discrimination requiring comprehensive institutional accountability. Federal transportation authorities announced comprehensive operational suspension. Gateway airport operations are suspended indefinitely pending federal investigation into systematic civil rights violations. All aviation activities cease immediately under Director Brooks's federal authority. The operational suspension demonstrated comprehensive federal power over aviation facilities when systematic discrimination violated both regulatory compliance and constitutional protections. Morrison made final attempt to minimize federal accountability. Director Brooks, if airport security appears excessive, that reflects post-9/11 federal requirements rather than discriminatory intent. Professional security assessment sometimes creates procedures that civil rights oversight might misinterpret. Brooks's response was definitive. Manager Morrison Systematic racial profiling violates federal aviation regulations and constitutional protections, regardless of security justification. Your discriminatory treatment constitutes serious federal crimes that professional authority neither requires nor justifies. As federal aviation authorities completed operational suspension while documenting systematic civil rights violations, the transformation was complete. The airport that had operated through institutional discrimination now faced comprehensive federal shutdown under the direct authority of the FAA director, whose family had experienced the same systematic bias affecting countless passengers. The airport manager, who had dismissed federal regulations as procedural guidelines, now faced comprehensive federal prosecution that would expose systematic aviation discrimination to accountability that operational authority couldn't prevent and administrative convenience couldn't influence. The morning following Director Brooks's operational suspension of Gateway International Airport triggered comprehensive federal investigation that transformed systematic aviation discrimination from tolerated institutional practice to federal criminal prosecution, while establishing unprecedented accountability standards for civil rights compliance across the transportation industry. Within 12 hours of operational suspension, Secretary of Transportation Patricia Williams announced formal federal investigation into civil rights compliance at major airports nationwide, recognizing that systematic discrimination represented institutional problems requiring federal accountability rather than local administrative correction. Manager Morrison's systematic discrimination against minority passengers, including Director Brooks's family, demonstrates institutional aviation bias that affects not only individual travelers, but broader transportation industry integrity when facilities violate federal regulations and constitutional protections, Williams announced during federal press conference. Director Brooks personally addressed aviation accountability during congressional testimony that would establish federal standards for civil rights compliance and discrimination prevention in transportation operations. Morrison's systematic bias represents institutional aviation discrimination that threatens both individual constitutional rights and broader transportation industry legitimacy when facilities enable rather than prevent civil rights violations, Brooks told House Transportation Committee. Her testimony elevated individual discrimination to systematic industry analysis that examined structural racism and federal accountability requirements for constitutional compliance in transportation operations. Congressional Representative Thompson announced legislative oversight during hearings focused on federal civil rights enforcement in aviation. Aviation discrimination represents systematic threats to equal access when transportation facilities enable rather than prevent constitutional violations. Federal accountability measures were implemented immediately, mandatory civil rights training for all aviation personnel, federal monitoring of passenger treatment patterns, automatic federal prosecution triggered by systematic discrimination, and operational certification tied to constitutional compliance rather than security metrics. Steve Morrison was convicted of federal civil rights violations and sentenced to 5 years in federal prison, the harshest punishment ever imposed for aviation discrimination, establishing precedent that transportation industry bias carried serious federal consequences. Steve Morrison systematically violated civil rights while abusing aviation authority that threatened equal access and transportation industry integrity, federal judge stated during sentencing. Aviation discrimination demands federal punishment that protects future passengers from systematic bias. Security Chief Walsh faced federal prosecution for enabling discrimination and received a 3-year sentence for civil rights conspiracy. his conviction demonstrating institutional accountability beyond individual misconduct. Gateway International Airport underwent complete federal restructuring under FAA direct oversight, new management team, comprehensive civil rights training, community oversight participation, and federal monitoring ensuring constitutional compliance while maintaining aviation safety. Federal oversight included establishment of Aviation Discrimination Victim Compensation Fund, totaling $67 million distributed among passengers affected by systematic bias, providing financial support for travel disruption, legal costs, and community programs addressing transportation discrimination. Dr. Marcus Johnson was appointed to Federal Aviation Oversight Board, ensuring that reform addressed passenger family priorities rather than administrative convenience. Federal accountability must serve constitutional compliance and industry. Reform that prevents future aviation discrimination rather than simply punishing individual bias. His professional perspective ensured that federal intervention addressed systematic institutional problems rather than focusing exclusively on individual criminal prosecution. Community healing programs addressed economic impact caused by systematic aviation discrimination and transportation civil rights violations. Aviation bias creates travel barriers affecting community members' access to business opportunities, family connections, and professional development. Economic healing required addressing not only individual discrimination but collective harm caused by systematic transportation industry bias that prevented community members from accessing essential travel services. Federal Emergency Management Agency announced aviation recovery assistance, recognizing that systematic transportation discrimination constituted economic disaster, requiring comprehensive federal support for industry reform and community restoration. Aviation discrimination represents economic disasters, requiring federal intervention for industry accountability and community access recovery. FEMA coordinator announced. Federal resources will support passenger assistance, industry reform, and community economic development. Civil rights attorney Davis announced comprehensive federal litigation representing affected passengers. We're filing federal lawsuits seeking damages for systematic civil rights violations affecting hundreds of travelers over multiple years. Federal compensation will address institutional harm while ensuring comprehensive industry reform. The civil litigation provided additional accountability beyond criminal prosecution while ensuring that systematic civil rights violations resulted in financial consequences that motivated industry reform rather than administrative tolerance. Federal Aviation Administration announced enhanced civil rights protocols requiring systematic constitutional compliance monitoring and automatic federal prosecution when facilities demonstrated bias or discrimination that threatened passenger rights. Constitutional compliance requires aviation systems that protect, rather than discriminate against, minority passengers. Federal Aviation Civil Rights Coordinator announced. Federal oversight ensures that aviation authority serves rather than violates equal access requirements. The systematic reform process concluded with permanent federal monitoring, statistical analysis of aviation civil rights compliance, community oversight with federal authority, automatic federal prosecution triggered by systematic bias, and congressional oversight ensuring sustained constitutional compliance. Data analysis 18 months after federal intervention showed remarkable improvements. Aviation discrimination incidents decreased by 97%, minority passenger satisfaction increased dramatically, and legitimate aviation effectiveness increased. As civil rights compliance enhanced rather than hindered professional transportation services. Constitutional compliance enhanced rather than compromised legitimate aviation effectiveness, federal oversight reported. Professional equal treatment provides better industry reputation than systematic discrimination, while protecting civil rights that aviation services must defend. The accountability process established permanent federal monitoring, ensuring that aviation constitutional compliance would be sustained through federal oversight rather than reverting to local administrative tolerance that had enabled systematic civil rights violations and transportation discrimination. The Johnson family's experience had catalyzed comprehensive reform, demonstrating that federal officials face serious consequences when their families experience the same discrimination affecting countless passengers, while establishing systems ensuring future constitutional compliance in aviation operations nationwide. Airport operations resumed under federal oversight, with completely restructured management committed to constitutional compliance rather than systematic bias, ensuring that transportation facilities served rather than violated the civil rights of all passengers. Over the following 36 months, Gateway International Airport underwent the most comprehensive civil rights transformation in aviation history, implementing changes that served as a global model for eliminating systematic discrimination, while enhancing legitimate transportation safety through constitutional compliance and equal treatment protocols. The Federal Aviation Civil Rights Compliance Commission, established under Department of Transportation Authority, was directed by former civil rights prosecutor Dr. Patricia Martinez, whose expertise in discrimination law and institutional reform made her uniquely qualified to rebuild aviation systems that had systematically violated constitutional protections. "We're not just removing biased personnel," Dr. Martinez explained during mandatory training attended by all 8,900 Gateway Airport employees and 4,500 regional aviation professionals. "We're building constitutional aviation systems that serve all passengers through equal treatment rather than systematic discrimination that violates federal regulations." The comprehensive training emphasized cultural competency, anti-bias passenger service, and civil rights compliance rather than discriminatory profiling, selective security treatment, and systematic bias that had characterized institutional aviation discrimination. Airport Director Jennifer Cole, appointed through federal oversight process, implemented revolutionary accountability measures throughout transportation operations. Every passenger interaction was now federally monitored, with real-time analysis, showing service delivery patterns and constitutional compliance assessment that ensured equal treatment rather than demographic-based discrimination. Aviation excellence requires constitutional systems that serve all travelers rather than discriminating against minority passengers, Cole explained to Federal Oversight Board. Professional transportation services based on safety standards rather than racial bias provide more effective passenger satisfaction while ensuring equal treatment compliance. The accountability framework made systematic discrimination organizationally impossible to sustain while ensuring that legitimate aviation could effectively serve diverse travelers through constitutional compliance rather than biased service delivery. Director Brooks worked with Department of Justice civil rights experts to develop the Gateway Protocol, comprehensive procedures for identifying and addressing aviation discrimination before it escalated to systematic civil rights violations requiring federal prosecution. Aviation facilities wield significant influence over travel access and must operate through constitutional compliance rather than systematic bias, Brooks explained during congressional testimony about transportation accountability. When airports enable discrimination, they threaten both individual civil rights and broader equal access requirements. Her framework elevated constitutional compliance from administrative requirement to aviation safety necessity that federal oversight would ensure through systematic monitoring and industry accountability. The Passenger Rights and Aviation Accountability Commission, established with authority independent of industry administration, included discrimination victims, civil rights advocates, legal experts, and federal representatives with power to investigate systematic bias, review aviation practices, and recommend federal prosecution for constitutional violations. Grandma Pearl Johnson, whose family experience had exposed systematic discrimination, served as community representative, ensuring that reform addressed actual passenger experiences rather than industry preferences or administrative convenience. Aviation services must serve constitutional protection and equal treatment rather than systematic discrimination or industry bias, Pearl told the Commission during quarterly reviews. Federal oversight ensures that aviation authority protects rather than violates the equal access rights of all passengers. Community control over oversight ensured that reform addressed travelers' experiences with systematic discrimination rather than aviation industry priorities or federal bureaucratic preferences. Federal aviation constitutional compliance protocols were enhanced nationwide through lessons learned from gateway operations, mandatory equal treatment training, automatic federal prosecution when facilities demonstrated bias, passenger protection programs, and federal certification tied to civil rights compliance rather than operational metrics. Equal treatment requires aviation systems that serve constitutional protection rather than enabling systematic discrimination, Federal Aviation Coordinator explained during industry training. Professional transportation services depend on constitutional compliance that protects rather than violates equal access. Federal oversight included establishment of Aviation Discrimination Victim Services Fund, totaling $234 million distributed among passengers affected by systematic industry bias, providing comprehensive support for legal assistance, travel disruption, compensation, and community programs addressing transportation discrimination. Tyler Johnson, Memorial Civil Rights Education Program, received federal funding to support minority students pursuing aviation management education, with emphasis on constitutional compliance and equal service delivery, ensuring that future industry leadership would protect rather than violate passenger civil rights. Education represents long-term industry change that prevents rather than responds to discrimination, Program Coordinator explained. Professional aviation education must emphasize constitutional compliance and equal treatment rather than demographic profiling and systematic bias. International Aviation Civil Rights Council coordinated global programs addressing aviation discrimination's impact on American reputation and international travel relationships. Aviation constitutional compliance represents American democratic values and international commitment to equal treatment that strengthens diplomatic relationships. International perspective provided crucial insight about aviation discrimination's global implications while ensuring that industry reform addressed diplomatic reputation and foreign visitor protection through constitutional compliance. Federal civil rights enforcement protocols were enhanced based on gateway experience, systematic monitoring of aviation constitutional compliance, automatic federal investigation triggered by transportation discrimination, community reporting systems for civil rights violations, and federal prosecution authority for systematic industry bias. Constitutional protection requires aviation industries that defend rather than violate equal access, Federal Civil Rights Coordinator announced. Constitutional compliance represents democratic necessity when transportation providers must protect rather than discriminate against minority passengers. Aviation management schools established discrimination prevention programs using Gateway case study to train future industry leaders in civil rights compliance and equal service delivery, rather than operational efficiency that might enable systematic bias. Aviation education must emphasize constitutional protection rather than demographic profiling that threatens equal access, Aviation Education Coordinator explained during industry conferences. Technology integration implemented across all major airports used artificial intelligence to monitor passenger treatment patterns and identify potential discrimination before it affected travel experiences or violated federal constitutional protections. Technology serves constitutional compliance by identifying bias patterns that human oversight might miss, Technology Coordinator explained. Systematic monitoring prevents discrimination rather than responding after civil rights violations occur. Industry competitors implemented similar constitutional monitoring after recognizing that systematic discrimination created legal liability and reputation damage that threatened business sustainability and passenger confidence. Gateway's transformation demonstrated that constitutional compliance enhances rather than hinders aviation business success, competitor executive explained during industry coordination meetings. Data analysis. 48 months into reform showed remarkable transformation. Aviation discrimination incidents decreased by 98%. Minority passenger satisfaction increased by 94%, and legitimate aviation effectiveness improved as constitutional compliance enhanced rather than hindered professional transportation services. Constitutional compliance enhanced rather than compromised legitimate aviation effectiveness, federal oversight reported. Professional equal treatment provides better industry reputation than systematic discrimination while protecting constitutional rights that transportation services must defend. International aviation organizations adopted Gateway's constitutional protocols as global standards for preventing discrimination while maintaining transportation safety through constitutional compliance and equal treatment requirements. Gateway Airport's transformation demonstrates that comprehensive civil rights reform can eliminate systematic discrimination while strengthening rather than weakening transportation industry effectiveness, International Aviation Coordinator announced. Federal oversight expansion included monitoring of ground transportation, maritime, and rail industries that provided public transportation, using aviation reform as model for eliminating systematic discrimination across all transportation sectors. Constitutional compliance requirements extend beyond aviation to all transportation serving the public, Federal Transportation Coordinator explained. Constitutional protection represents universal requirement for industries serving diverse communities. The Gateway transformation had created permanent federal monitoring, ensuring that aviation constitutional compliance would prevent rather than respond to discrimination, protecting future passengers from industry bias while ensuring equal access to transportation through professional service delivery that served rather than violated constitutional principles. 5 years after manager Morrison's systematic discrimination against the Johnson family, Gateway International Airport had become the global standard for aviation civil rights compliance, demonstrating how comprehensive federal intervention could eliminate institutional bias while enhancing transportation safety through constitutional equal treatment and professional service delivery. The transformation was evident throughout the completely redesigned facility. Aviation operations that had once operated through systematic discrimination now featured constitutional compliance protocols based on equal treatment and passenger dignity. The atmosphere of institutional bias and selective service had been replaced by transparent accountability, professional aviation services, and genuine respect for all travelers regardless of background or appearance. Director Brooks returned. to Gateway Airport for the dedication of the Aviation Civil Rights and Constitutional Compliance Center, a permanent reminder of how family experience with discrimination could catalyze comprehensive industry reform that protected equal access, while honoring constitutional principles. This center represents what aviation excellence looks like when constitutional protection and equal treatment are integrated into every aspect of transportation operations, Brooks announced during the dedication ceremony attended by 200 aviation professionals, civil rights advocates, and federal officials. The comprehensive training facility provided evidence-based aviation education that emphasized constitutional compliance while maintaining transportation safety through professional rather than discriminatory passenger treatment. When aviation operates constitutionally, every transportation indicator improves, Brooks explained to visiting airport executives from other facilities. Passenger satisfaction increases because travelers trust, rather than fear, security interactions. Constitutional violations decrease through professional accountability, and industry reputation strengthens rather than deteriorates through systematic bias. Airport Director Cole, whose federal oversight leadership had been crucial for implementing constitutional reform, displayed statistical evidence of transformation that demonstrated comprehensive improvement in both civil rights compliance and legitimate aviation effectiveness. Constitutional compliance enhanced every aspect of airport operations, Cole told Federal Oversight Delegation. Passenger confidence increased by 91%, discrimination complaints decreased to 0, and aviation excellence improved as staff focused on professional transportation rather than demographic profiling. Her leadership of institutional transformation proved that constitutional protection served rather than hindered aviation effectiveness when implemented through comprehensive federal oversight and community accountability. Dr. Marcus Johnson, whose family experience had been essential for exposing Morrison's discrimination, now directed the National Aviation Civil Rights Monitoring Project, ensuring that transportation industry accountability would continue through passenger engagement, rather than administrative convenience. Morrison's systematic bias taught us that documenting discrimination represents civic duty, rather than optional advocacy. Johnson explained to passenger advocacy groups, constitutional aviation must face community oversight when transportation providers protect rather than violate the civil rights they are required to defend. His transformation from discrimination victim to civil rights advocate demonstrated how personal experience with institutional bias could be channeled into systematic constitutional protection and industry accountability. The Federal Aviation Constitutional Compliance Office had expanded Gateway's protocols to monitor transportation constitutional compliance in 2,247 aviation facilities, using statistical analysis and community feedback to identify systematic bias before it escalated to civil rights violations requiring federal prosecution. Steve Morrison had completed his federal sentence and been permanently barred from aviation industry employment, his conviction for systematic discrimination serving as industry deterrent for transportation bias and constitutional violations. His conviction and imprisonment had established precedent that aviation employees faced serious federal consequences for systematic discrimination, regardless of security justification or administrative protection. Security Chief Walsh had been terminated from all transportation industry positions permanently, his enabling of systematic discrimination demonstrating that supervisory tolerance for bias carried career consequences equivalent to active participation in civil rights violations. Civil rights attorney Davis had established the Global Aviation Civil Rights Accountability Project, providing legal representation for passengers facing discrimination while ensuring systematic federal intervention rather than individual case resolution that ignored broader constitutional compliance. Constitutional violations by aviation industries represent federal crimes that threaten both individual constitutional protection and broader equal access legitimacy, Davis explained during international civil rights conferences. Federal aviation. Constitutional compliance protocols developed through Gateway experience had eliminated systematic discrimination while enhancing legitimate transportation protection, professional treatment standards, automatic federal prosecution for bias, community constitutional monitoring, and institutional accountability for equal access compliance. Dr. Martinez, whose oversight had transformed aviation civil rights compliance, had become Director of Global Transportation Constitutional Reform, using systematic accountability to prevent rather than respond to discrimination across all transportation sectors. Constitutional compliance represents transportation necessity when aviation industries must protect rather than violate equal access, Martinez told international transportation conferences. As Brooks toured the Constitutional Compliance Center, that honored family experience, while celebrating systematic industry reform, she reflected on how challenging aviation discrimination had catalyzed comprehensive federal accountability, protecting millions of passengers while strengthening rather than weakening transportation industry effectiveness. The airport where Morrison had violated constitutional rights now represented global leadership in civil rights protection and equal treatment that served rather than violated democratic principles and equal access requirements. Most importantly, Gateway demonstrated that constitutional aviation enhanced rather than compromised transportation excellence, that civil rights protection strengthened rather than weakened industry reputation, and that systematic reform created better transportation. Rather than operational limitations, the FAA director, whose family had been dismissed as security risks, now left behind institutions where constitutional protection was guaranteed through federal oversight, where transportation excellence was achieved through civil rights compliance, and where aviation authorities served, rather than violated the equal access principles that defined democratic society. That transformation, from systematic discrimination to constitutional compliance, from institutional bias to equal treatment, from transportation discrimination to civil rights protection, represented the kind of change that made aviation authority serve its constitutional purpose of providing equal access rather than violating the rights of passengers. It was designed to serve. The federal investigation that began with family discrimination had evolved into comprehensive transportation reform that demonstrated how personal experience could trigger institutional transformation when backed by federal commitment to constitutional principles and civil rights protection that defended rather than threatened democratic access to essential transportation services. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.